some women become notorious figures in society, leaving behind a trail of violence and destruction. Aileen Carol Wuornos, February 29, 1956 to October 9, 2002, remains one of the most polarizing figures in modern criminal history. Dubbed the Damsel of Death by the media, she confessed to murdering 7 men in Florida between 1989 and 1990 while working as a highway prostitute. Her life, marked by severe abuse, poverty, and mental illness, has sparked ongoing debates about trauma, justice, and the ethics of the death penalty. Her execution in 2002 remains controversial, with some seeing her as a cold-blooded serial killer and others as a tragic figure failed by society. Her story has been widely covered in books, documentaries, and films, most notably in the 2003 film Monster, which earned Charlize Theron an Academy Award for her portrayal of Wuornos. Born in Rochester, Michigan, Wuornos had a troubled and traumatic childhood. Her mother, Diane Wuornos, was only 15 when she married Eileen's father, Leo Pittman, a convicted child molester and diagnosed schizophrenic. Before Aileen turned 4, Diane abandoned her and her brother, Keith, leaving them in the care of their maternal grandparents, Lori and Britta Wuornos. The household was far from stable. Aileen later claimed that both grandparents were abusive alcoholics. Her father, Leo, was imprisoned for the sexual assault of a minor and later committed suicide in 1969 by hanging himself in his cell. Meanwhile, Eileen's life spiraled into darkness at a young age. By age 11, she was allegedly engaging in sex work, trading sexual favors for cigarettes, food, and money. Friends and acquaintances from her childhood recalled her being isolated, frequently ridiculed, and struggling with deep-seated anger. At 15, after becoming pregnant, reportedly due to rape by one of her grandfather's friends, she was kicked out of her home. She gave birth to a baby boy in 1971, who was quickly placed for adoption. The identity and whereabouts of her child remain unknown. Now homeless and abandoned, Aileen survived by hitchhiking, engaging in sex work, and living in the woods near her Michigan hometown before eventually making her way to Florida. Wuornos' criminal record began long before her killing spree. In 1974, she was arrested for driving under the influence, disorderly conduct, and firing a pistol from a moving vehicle. Over the next decade, she was involved in numerous crimes, including armed robbery, forgery, assault, and theft. By the mid-1980s, Wuornos had become a known figure along Florida's highways, engaging in sex work to support herself. In 1986, she met Tyria Moore, a 24-year-old hotel maid, at a Daytona Beach biker bar. The two quickly became romantically involved, and Wuornos supported them financially through sex work. Witnesses and former acquaintances described their relationship as intense but unstable, with Wuornos prone to violent outbursts. Some believe that Wuornos' desperation to provide for more played a role in her decision to kill. Between 1989 and 1990, Wuornos murdered 7 men in cold blood, though she later claimed the killings were in self-defense against rape attempts. The forensic evidence and witness testimonies, however, suggested otherwise. Her victims, all middle-aged white men, were shot multiple times, execution style, and their bodies were dumped in isolated areas. Victims: Richard Mallory, November 30, 1989, a 51-year-old electronics store owner with a criminal record for sexual assault. Wuornos later testified that he raped her, but prosecutors argued she stole his belongings. David Spears, May 19, 1990, a 43-year-old construction worker shot 6 times and left nude along a remote road. Charles Carskadden, May 31, 1990, a 40-year-old part-time rodeo worker found with 9 gunshot wounds. Peter Seams, June 6, 1990, a 65-year-old missionary who disappeared. His body was never found, but his car was linked to Wuornos and Moore. Troy Burress, July 30, 1990, a 50-year-old salesman shot twice in the torso. Dick Humphreys, September 11, 1990, a 56-year-old former Air Force major and child abuse investigator killed execution style. Walter Antonio, November 19, 1990, a 62-year-old retired police officer shot 4 times and left on a remote logging road. Authorities linked Wuornos to the murders through ballistic evidence and pawn shop transactions where she had sold items belonging to the victims. The breakthrough came when investigators traced Peter Seams' abandoned car to a Florida pawn shop where Wuornos and Moore had left fingerprints. On January 9, 1991, police arrested Wuornos at a Daytona Beach biker bar called The Last Resort. Moore, fearing prosecution, agreed to cooperate with law enforcement. She called Wuornos from a police-controlled phone and convinced her to confess while the call was being recorded. Wuornos' first trial, for the murder of Richard Mallory, began in January 1992. She initially pleaded self-defense but later changed her story multiple times. Despite being diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and antisocial traits, she was deemed legally sane. Wuornos was found guilty and sentenced to death. In the following months, she pleaded guilty to 5 more murders and received additional death sentences. By 2001, Wuornos had grown increasingly erratic, paranoid, and mentally unstable. She waived all appeals, insisting she wanted to be executed. She claimed she was tired of the prison system and that she was being tortured behind bars. In a chilling statement, she said, "I killed those men. I robbed them as cold as ice. And I'd do it again, too." She was executed by lethal injection on October 9, 2002, at Florida State Prison. Her final words were bizarre and cryptic. "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day, with Jesus. June 6th, like the movie, big mothership and all." Wuornos' case remains one of the most debated in the history of American crime. Some see her as a ruthless killer, while others believe she was a deeply traumatized woman who lashed out at a world that had abused and discarded her. Her life has been the subject of multiple books and films. The documentary Aileen, Life and Death of a Serial Killer, 2003, explored her declining mental state and possible schizophrenia. The Oscar-winning film Monster, 2003, portrayed her as both a victim and a killer, but it also faced criticism for altering aspects of the real story. Wuornos' case continues to be analyzed in discussions on the death penalty, gender, trauma, and justice. Was she an irredeemable monster, or was she a product of severe neglect and abuse? Her life and crimes raise questions that may never have definitive answers, ensuring that her name remains one of the most infamous in American criminal history. Next on the list is Karla Faye Tucker. On February 3, 1998, Karla Faye Tucker became the first woman executed in Texas since 1863, drawing international attention not only for the brutality of her crime, but for her dramatic transformation from a drug-addicted murderer to a born-again Christian whose pleas for clemency polarized the nation. Her case ignited debates about the death penalty, redemption, and the role of gender in justice, leaving a legacy that continues to resonate in discussions about capital punishment. Karla Faye Tucker was born on November 18, 1959, in Houston, Texas, to a family marred by instability and vice. Her mother, Carolyn, worked as a sex worker, and Karla was introduced to drugs and crime as a child. By age 8, she was using marijuana, and by her early teens, she had dropped out of school and become addicted to heroin. Her turbulent upbringing included a brief marriage at 14 to a 22-year-old man, which ended quickly. By her early 20s, Tucker was entrenched in Houston's criminal underworld, associating with biker gangs and surviving through theft and sex work. The crime that sealed Tucker's fate occurred on June 13, 1983. Tucker, then 23, and her boyfriend, Daniel Ryan Garrett, 38, planned to burglarize the Houston apartment of Jerry Lynn Dean, a 27-year-old construction worker. Dean had recently parted ways with Garrett, who held a grudge over a motorcycle dispute. The pair, high on a cocktail of drugs, broke into Dean's home intending to steal motorcycle parts. What began as a burglary escalated into a gruesome double homicide. Inside the apartment, they found Dean asleep beside Deborah Ruth Thornton, a 32-year-old married woman who had accompanied Dean to the apartment after a party. Tucker later confessed that she attacked Dean with a pickaxe, striking him repeatedly while he slept. Thornton, who hid under a blanket, was also brutally killed. Tucker infamously claimed she experienced sexual gratification with each strike. Both victims suffered multiple deep wounds to the chest and head. The savagery of the crime, and Tucker's lack of remorse at the time, shocked investigators. Tucker and Garrett were arrested days later. During interrogations, Tucker initially denied involvement but eventually confessed, detailing the murders with chilling detachment. Her defense argued that her drug use and traumatic upbringing mitigated her culpability, but prosecutors emphasized the premeditated nature of the crime. In 1984, a Harris County jury convicted Tucker of capital murder. Under Texas law, the brutality of the killings and Tucker's future dangerousness qualified her for the death penalty. Garrett received the same sentence but died in prison in 1993 from liver disease. Tucker's time on death row became a story of profound personal change. In 1984, after a fellow inmate shared Bible verses with her, Tucker underwent a religious conversion. She became a devout Christian, studying theology and mentoring other prisoners. Her case attracted support from global religious figures, including Pope John Paul II and televangelist Pat Robertson, who cited her redemption as grounds for mercy. By the mid-1990s, Tucker's appeals had been exhausted, and her execution date loomed. Her legal team petitioned for clemency, arguing her transformation and model behavior in prison warranted life imprisonment. The campaign gained momentum through media appearances, including a 1995 primetime live interview with Diane Sawyer, where Tucker expressed deep remorse, "I deserve to be punished, but I don't deserve to die." Tucker's plea divided conservatives, particularly in Texas, where support for the death penalty was strong. Governor George W. Bush, a proponent of capital punishment, faced intense pressure. Religious conservatives, including prominent Republicans like Jerry Falwell, urged Bush to commute her sentence, while victims' rights advocates and prosecutors insisted the law demanded impartiality. The case also spotlighted gender bias. Some argued Tucker's sympathetic portrayal, a petite, soft-spoken woman, contrasted with the typically male-dominated death row population. Critics questioned whether her gender and newfound faith unfairly influenced public opinion. On February 3, 1998, Tucker was executed by lethal injection. Her final words were an apology to the victims' families. "I would like to say to all of you, the Thornton family and Jerry Dean's family, that I am so sorry. I hope God will give you peace with this." Deborah Thornton's sister, however, dismissed Tucker's remorse as insincere, stating, "She's forgiven by God, but she still has to pay her debt to society." Tucker's execution reignited debates about the morality of the death penalty, particularly for rehabilitated offenders. Her story remains a touchstone in discussions about justice, mercy, and whether redemption can, or should, override legal punishment. Carla Faye Tucker's case endures as a cultural and legal paradox. Supporters view her as a symbol of the power of redemption. Detractors argue that her crime's heinousness justified her sentence. Her execution underscored Texas' unwavering stance on capital punishment, even as it prompted introspection about the system's humanity. Today, Tucker's story is cited in studies about gender, religion, and the death penalty, a haunting reminder of the complexities inherent in justice. Next, we move to Velma Margie Barfield, known infamously as the Death Row Granny, became a symbol of both the complexities of criminal justice and the moral debates surrounding capital punishment in the United States. Her story is one of tragedy, desperation, and calculated violence, culminating in her execution by lethal injection on November 2, 1984. Barfield's case marked a grim milestone. She was the first woman executed in the U.S. following the Supreme Court's 1976 reinstatement of the death penalty after a brief moratorium. Over a decade earlier, Barfield had poisoned 6 people, including her fiancé, using arsenic to conceal her crimes and alleviate financial desperation. Her life and actions reveal a chilling intersection of societal pressures, mental health struggles, and the consequences of unchecked violence. Born Velma Margie Bullard on October 29, 1932, in rural South Carolina, Barfield grew up in a strict, religious household. Her father, a sharecropper, was physically abusive, and her mother, devoutly Baptist, instilled a fear of moral transgression in her children. Barfield later described her childhood as marked by emotional neglect and violence, factors that psychologists speculate contributed to her later instability. At 17, she married Thomas Burke, a mechanic, and moved to North Carolina. The couple had 2 children, but the marriage collapsed under financial strain and Burke's infidelity. Burke died in 1967 from a heart attack, leaving Barfield widowed and struggling to support her family. Barfield remarried in 1969 to Jennings Barfield, a man 27 years her senior. Their relationship was fraught with tension, exacerbated by Jennings' alcoholism and Velma's growing reliance on prescription drugs to manage anxiety and depression. Jennings died suddenly in 1971 from a reported respiratory illness, though no autopsy was performed. His death marked the beginning of Velma's descent into criminality. By the early 1970s, Barfield was drowning in debt. To cope, she began forging checks, stealing from employers, and defrauding acquaintances. Her schemes escalated when she took a job as a caretaker for elderly patients, a role that granted her access to their finances. When suspicions arose about missing money, Barfield resorted to poisoning her victims to silence them. Arsenic, a readily available pesticide, became her weapon of choice. The poison's symptoms, vomiting, diarrhea, and organ failure, mimicked natural illnesses, allowing Barma to evade detection for years. Barfield's first confirmed murder victim was her mother, Lillian Bullard, in 1974. Bullard had grown suspicious of her daughter's financial mismanagement and threatened to expose her. After serving her mother a cup of tea laced with arsenic, Bullard died days later. A doctor attributed her death to natural causes, emboldening Barfield. Over the next 4 years, Barfield poisoned 5 more individuals. Montgomery Edge, 1975, a 84-year-old man she cared for. Edge's family hired Barfield as a live-in nurse, but after they noticed money missing, he fell ill and died. Dolly Edwards, 1975, another elderly patient who employed Barfield. Edwards' death was initially labeled a heart attack. Record Lee Hunsucker, 1975, Barfield's employer at a textile factory. Hunsucker fired her for theft, and he died weeks later. John Henry Lee, 1976, a landlord who confronted Barfield about unpaid rent. Stuart Taylor, 1978, Barfield's fiancé, whose death finally triggered an investigation. Taylor's death in 1978 raised red flags. After ingesting arsenic-laced beer, Taylor suffered a prolonged, painful death. His family demanded an autopsy, which revealed lethal levels of arsenic. Barfield, who stood to inherit Taylor's life insurance, was arrested and charged with murder. Barfield's trial began in 1978 in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Prosecutors painted her as a remorseless killer motivated by greed. Defense attorneys argued that Barfield's addiction to prescription drugs, notably Valium, and a lifetime of trauma had impaired her judgment. However, evidence against her was overwhelming. Arsenic was found in Taylor's body, and Barfield had purchased rat poison containing arsenic days before his death. Facing the death penalty, Barfield confessed to Taylor's murder in exchange for life imprisonment. The plea deal was rejected, and she was sentenced to death. Over time, Barfield admitted to 5 other poisonings, though she was never formally charged for those crimes. Barfield's 6-year tenure on death row transformed her public image. She became a born-again Christian, writing letters of apology to victims' families and advocating against drug addiction. Her memoir, Woman on Death Row, detailed her remorse and newfound faith. Supporters, including religious leaders, lobbied for clemency, arguing her redemption warranted mercy. Opponents, including victims' families, insisted justice demanded her execution. North Carolina Governor Jim Hunt declined to commute her sentence, stating, "The law must be applied equally, regardless of gender." Barfield's final appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court was denied hours before her execution. At 2 a.m. on November 2, 1984, Barfield was executed by lethal injection at Central Prison in Raleigh. Her last words were a prayer, "Dear Heavenly Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." Barfield's case ignited debates about the death penalty's fairness, particularly regarding women. Of the 16 women executed in the U.S. since 1976, Barfield's story remains the most scrutinized. Psychologists have speculated that her crimes stemmed from Munchausen syndrome by proxy or a pathological need for control, though no formal diagnosis was made. Her victims' families expressed mixed emotions. Stuart Taylor's son remarked, "She showed no mercy to my father. Why should she receive any?" Others, including Barfield's children, mourned her as a victim of circumstance. Velma Barfield's life serves as a haunting reminder of how desperation and mental illness can intersect with violence. Her execution, while controversial, underscored the legal system's rigidity in cases of premeditated murder. Decades later, her story continues to provoke questions about justice, redemption, and the human capacity for evil. Next is Betty Lou Beets, a name etched into the annals of American criminal history, became a focal point of national debate over the death penalty, domestic violence, and the judicial system's handling of women who kill abusive partners. Her execution by lethal injection on February 24, 2000, marked the end of a legal saga that spanned nearly 2 decades, but the questions surrounding her case, about justice, mercy, and the intersection of gender and violence, remain unresolved. This essay delves into the life, crimes, trial, and execution of Betty Lou Beets, weaving together the complex narrative of a woman whose story is as much a reflection of systemic failures as it is of personal culpability. Born Betty Lou Denton on June 12, 1937, in Haskell, Texas, Betty's early life was marked by poverty and instability. The daughter of a sharecropper, she grew up in rural Texas during the Great Depression and World War II, an era when opportunities for women, particularly in impoverished communities, were severely limited. By age 15, she married her first husband, an older man named Paul Scott, and gave birth to the first of her 9 children. This marriage, like those that followed, was fraught with turmoil. Scott was reportedly abusive, a pattern that would repeat in Betty's subsequent relationships. Over the next 3 decades, Betty married 5 times, each union ending in separation, divorce, or death. Her second husband, Norman Stout, with whom she had 2 children, also allegedly subjected her to physical violence. By the time she married her third husband, Billy York Lane, in the 1960s, Betty's life had become a cycle of transient relationships, financial struggle, and escalating desperation. It was Betty's 4th marriage, to Doyle Wayne Barker in 1979, that marked a darker turn. Barker, a truck driver, was described by those who knew him as a volatile and controlling figure. Friends and family later recounted instances of brutal domestic abuse, including beatings that left Betty hospitalized. In 1981, Barker's body was found in a shallow grave on property Betty owned in Henderson County, Texas. Initially ruled a suicide by gunshot, authorities closed the case with little scrutiny. It wasn't until after Betty's arrest for the murder of her 5th husband, Jimmy Don Beats, that investigators reopened Barker's case, exhuming his remains and reclassifying his death as a homicide. By then, Betty was already on trial for a crime that would cement her place in history as one of Texas's most notorious murderers. In 1983, Betty married Jimmy Don Beats, a firefighter and former Marine. On the surface, Jimmy Don seemed a stabilizing force. He provided financial security through his job at the Lakeview Fire Department and appeared devoted to Betty and her youngest children. However, the relationship quickly deteriorated. Neighbors and family members reported frequent violent arguments, and Betty later claimed Jimmy Don subjected her to physical and emotional abuse. What is undisputed is that in August 1983, Jimmy Don disappeared. Betty told authorities he had abandoned her, a story she maintained for nearly 2 years. During this time, she collected over $100,000 from his life insurance policies, a motive prosecutors would later emphasize as central to the crime. The truth began to unravel in 1985, when authorities received an anonymous tip suggesting Jimmy Don's remains were buried beneath a decorative wishing well in the front yard of the couple's mobile home. Excavations revealed his body, wrapped in a sleeping bag and shot twice in the head with a .38 caliber revolver. Forensic evidence confirmed Betty had purchased the weapon shortly before his disappearance. Further investigations uncovered the earlier murder of Doyle Barker, whose body was found buried under a flower bed on the same property. Betty was charged with both murders, but prosecutors focused on Jimmy Don's case, believing it offered the clearest path to a conviction. The trial of Betty Lou Beats, held in Henderson County in 1985, became a media sensation. Prosecutors painted Betty as a calculating killer who murdered husbands for financial gain, pointing to the insurance payouts and the cold-blooded disposal of the bodies. They presented evidence that she had forged Jimmy Don's signature on insurance documents and highlighted her purchase of the murder weapon. The defense, led by attorney Dennis Jones, argued that Betty's son, Robert Branson, had killed Jimmy Don in a fit of rage, claiming Branson, a convicted felon with a history of violence, acted without Betty's knowledge. This strategy backfired when Branson testified against his mother, recounting how she had coerced him into helping bury the body and threatened him into silence. The jury, unmoved by claims of abuse or coercion, convicted Betty of capital murder after just 3 hours of deliberation. She was sentenced to death, becoming one of the few women on Texas's death row. The appeals process that followed spanned 15 years, with Betty's legal team arguing that her trial had been fundamentally unfair. They contended that her court-appointed attorneys failed to investigate her history of abuse or present mitigating evidence that might have swayed the jury toward a life sentence. Psychological evaluations described Betty as suffering from battered woman syndrome, a condition that could have explained her compliance in the aftermath of the murders. Appellate lawyers also highlighted the all-white, predominantly male jury, suggesting implicit bias influenced the verdict. These arguments, however, were repeatedly rejected by state and federal courts. In 1999, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear her final appeal, clearing the way for her execution. As Betty's execution date approached, her case attracted international attention. Advocacy groups, including Amnesty International, argued that executing a woman who had endured decades of abuse would perpetuate systemic injustices. Supporters pointed to studies showing that women who kill abusive partners often receive harsher sentences than men who claim self-defense against abuse. Opponents, including prosecutors and victims' rights advocates, countered that Betty's crimes were premeditated acts of greed, unrelated to self-preservation. The debate reached a fever pitch in the weeks leading up to her execution, with vigils held outside the Texas governor's mansion and the Supreme Court receiving thousands of clemency petitions. On February 24, 2000, Betty Lou Beets was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. Her last meal, a modest request of fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and peach cobbler, was a stark contrast to the gravity of the moment. In her final statement, she expressed love for her family but maintained her innocence, telling witnesses, "I'm not the one that killed him." The execution proceeded without complication, and Betty was pronounced dead at 6:47 p.m. She became the second woman executed in Texas since 1863, following Carla Faye Tucker in 1998. The aftermath of Betty's execution did little to quell the controversies surrounding her case. Legal scholars continue to debate whether her trial adequately accounted for the complexities of domestic violence, particularly in an era when battered woman syndrome was poorly understood by many courts. Feminist theorists argue that her case underscores the criminal justice system's failure to contextualize women's violence within broader patterns of systemic abuse. Others maintain that the severity of her crimes, cold-blooded murder for financial gain, warranted the ultimate punishment, regardless of her personal history. Betty Lou Beets' story is a mosaic of tragedy, violence, and moral ambiguity. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about how society perceives women who kill, the adequacy of legal defenses for abuse survivors, and the ethical implications of capital punishment. Her life, marked by cycles of abuse and desperation, and her death, sanctioned by the state, serve as a somber reminder of the human cost of systemic failures. Whether viewed as a villain or a victim, Betty Lou Beets remains a symbol of the enduring complexities at the heart of justice in America. Second to last on the list is Teresa Lewis. Teresa Lewis, a woman from Pittsylvania County, Virginia, became a focal point of national controversy in 2010 when she was executed by lethal injection for orchestrating the 2002 murders of her husband, Julian Clifton Lewis, and her stepson, Charles Julian Lewis. Her case drew intense scrutiny due to her low IQ, reportedly 72, claims of manipulation by co-conspirators, and the stark imbalance in sentencing compared to the men who carried out the killings. Lewis's execution on September 23, 2010, marked the first time in nearly a century that Virginia had put a woman to death, reigniting debates about intellectual disability, gender bias, and the ethics of capital punishment. Teresa Lewis, née Bean, was born in 1969 in Danville, Virginia, and grew up in poverty. Described by acquaintances as socially eager but intellectually limited, she struggled in school and held low-wage jobs as an adult. Her first marriage ended in divorce, and in 2000, she married Julian Lewis, a 51-year-old truck driver. Julian brought his adult son, Charles, into the household, and the trio lived in a mobile home in rural Pittsylvania County. By 2002, the marriage had deteriorated. Teresa began an affair with Matthew Schallenberger, a 23-year-old neighbor, and conspired with him and his friend Rodney Fuller to kill Julian and Charles. Her motive was financial. Julian had 2 life insurance policies totaling $250,000, with Teresa as the sole beneficiary. According to court records, Teresa actively recruited Schallenberger and Fuller, offering them money and sexual favors in exchange for committing the murders. On the night of October 30, 2002, Schallenberger and Fuller entered the Lewis home while Julian and Charles slept. Julian was shot twice in the chest with a shotgun, and Charles was shot 5 times as he attempted to flee. Teresa initially claimed ignorance, telling police she had been asleep during the killings. However, investigators quickly uncovered inconsistencies in her story. Schallenberger and Fuller were arrested within days, and both implicated Teresa as the mastermind. The prosecution argued that Teresa Lewis meticulously planned the murders to collect the insurance payout. Evidence included her purchase of the shotgun used in the killings, phone records showing coordination with Schallenberger, and testimony about her promises of payment. Crucially, Teresa had increased Julian's life insurance policy months before the murders. Her defense team emphasized her low IQ, 72, just above the threshold for intellectual disability, and argued that Schallenberger, a charismatic and manipulative figure, had coerced her into the plot. Psychologists testified that Teresa's cognitive limitations made her susceptible to exploitation. Despite this, the jury found her guilty of capital murder in 2003. Under Virginia's Triggerman rule, only the actual killers could face the death penalty, But Teresa was charged under a statute that allowed the death penalty for orchestrators of murder-for-hire schemes. She was sentenced to death, while Schallenberger and Fuller received life sentences. Teresa's case attracted international attention as advocates argued that her execution would be a miscarriage of justice. Opponents of the death penalty highlighted her intellectual limitations and the disproportionate severity of her sentence compared to Schallenberger and Fuller, who had carried out the violence. High-profile figures, including author John Grisham, called for clemency, citing concerns about her mental capacity and gender-based disparities in sentencing. Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell declined to commute her sentence, asserting that the jury had appropriately weighed the evidence. The U.S. Supreme Court denied a final appeal hours before her execution, with Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg notably dissenting. Teresa Lewis was executed at Greensville Correctional Center on September 23, 2010. In her final statement, she expressed remorse. "I just want Kathy, her daughter, to know I love her, and I'm very sorry." Her death reignited debates about the death penalty's application to individuals with intellectual impairments. While the Supreme Court banned executing the intellectually disabled in Atkins v. Virginia, 2002, Teresa's IQ fell just outside the threshold many states use, typically 70 or below. Critics argued that her case exposed flaws in rigid IQ-based standards. The Teresa Lewis case remains a lightning rod for discussions about manipulation, gender, and justice. Supporters of her execution argued that she was a calculating manipulator who exploited Schallenberger's vulnerabilities, not the other way around. Others viewed her as a victim of systemic inequities, pointing to her poverty, lack of education, and the legal system's failure to account for her cognitive limitations. Legal scholars have cited her case in calls for reforming death penalty statutes, particularly regarding non-triggerman defendants and intellectual disability assessments. Her story endures as a grim reminder of the complexities inherent in capital punishment. Finally on the list is Lisa Montgomery. On December 16, 2004, the small town of Skidmore, Missouri, was shattered by a crime of unfathomable brutality. Bobby Jo Stinnett, a 23-year-old pregnant woman, was found lifeless in her home, her unborn child violently removed from her womb. The perpetrator, Lisa Marie Montgomery, would become the first woman executed by the federal government in nearly 7 decades, her case igniting fierce debates about mental illness, justice, and the ethics of capital punishment. This essay traces Montgomery's harrowing life, the horrific crime that ended 2 lives, and the legal and moral complexities that culminated in her execution on January 13, 2021. Bobby Jo Stinnett, 8 months pregnant, was known in her community for breeding rat terriers. On the afternoon of December 16th, she agreed to meet a woman named Darlene Fisher, who had expressed interest in buying a puppy. Unbeknownst to Stinnett, Darlene was Lisa Montgomery, a 36-year-old Kansas woman who had spent months fabricating a pregnancy to her family and friends. Montgomery's ruse began unraveling as her supposed due date approached, driving her to desperate measures. Arriving at Stinnett's home, Montgomery attacked the young mother, strangling her with a rope and using a kitchen knife to perform a crude cesarean section. She fled with the infant, leaving Stinnett to bleed to death. Hours later, Montgomery presented the newborn to her husband, Kevin, claiming she had just given birth. Suspicious neighbors, however, alerted authorities after noticing inconsistencies in her story. By the following day, law enforcement tracked Montgomery to her Melbourne, Kansas, farmhouse, where they rescued the baby, Victoria Jo Stinnett, and arrested Montgomery. The child was returned to her father, Zeb Stinnett, but the trauma of losing his wife in such a grotesque manner would linger forever. Lisa Montgomery's descent into violence cannot be disentangled from the horrific abuse she endured from childhood. Born in 1968 in Kansas, she was the 4th of 6 children in a family marred by dysfunction. Her stepfather, Jack Kleiner, began sexually assaulting her at age 11, raping her repeatedly while her mother, Judy Shaughnessy, allegedly ignored the abuse. Neighbors and relatives later testified that Shaughnessy participated in the torment, telling Lisa she was ugly and worthless while forcing her to perform manual labor. Kleiner's abuse escalated to trafficking Lisa to men in exchange for money or tools, once remarking, "If you're going to rape her, you might as well pay for it." By adolescence, Lisa exhibited signs of severe psychological distress. She developed dissociative episodes, a common trauma response, and began self-harming. At 18, she married her first husband, Carl Bowman, but the union replicated the violence of her upbringing. Bowman beat her, choked her, and raped her at knife point, even as she bore 4 children. During this period, Lisa underwent a tubal ligation, rendering her unable to conceive, a fact she hid while later fabricating pregnancies to seek validation. Mental health experts who evaluated Lisa diagnosed her with bipolar disorder, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, CPTSD, and pseudocyesis, a rare condition causing false pregnancy delusions. Brain scans revealed permanent damage to her hippocampus and prefrontal cortex, likely from prolonged trauma, impairing her impulse control and reality perception. Dr. Catherine Porterfield, a clinical psychologist, testified that Lisa's psychosis led her to believe the baby was hers and she was saving it. Montgomery's federal trial in 2007 centered on whether her mental state mitigated her culpability. Prosecutors painted her as a cold, calculating killer who meticulously planned the murder, citing her internet searches for cesarean sections and how to cut an umbilical cord. They argued she targeted Stinnett after connecting with her on rat terrier enthusiast forums, exploiting the victim's trust to carry out a womb robbery. The defense, led by attorney Fred Dutchert, did not dispute Montgomery's guilt but pleaded for a life sentence, emphasizing her psychosis and trauma history. Witnesses, including Lisa's siblings, detailed the systemic abuse she endured. Dr. John Rabin, an expert in fetal abduction cases, noted that such crimes are often committed by women experiencing pregnancy delusions, driven by a desperate need to replace a lost child or maintain a relationship. The jury, however, deemed the crime premeditated and heinous enough to warrant the death penalty. In 2008, Montgomery was sentenced to death under the Federal Death Penalty Act of 1994, becoming one of 62 women on federal death row at the time. Over the next 13 years, Montgomery's legal team filed relentless appeals, arguing her mental incompetence barred execution under the Eighth Amendment's prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment. They cited her deteriorating psyche in prison, where she hallucinated, smeared feces, and referred to herself in the third person. In 2012, a district court judge vacated her death sentence, ruling her counsel had inadequately investigated her mental illness. The Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals reversed this decision, reinstating her execution. The Trump administration's 2019 revival of federal executions after a 17-year hiatus sealed Montgomery's fate. Despite petitions from mental health advocates, including the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, and Amnesty International, the Supreme Court denied a stay in January 2021. Her final days were marked by emotional appeals. Her lawyers described her as brain-damaged and mentally ill, and argued executing her would be a grave injustice. On January 13, 2021, at the Federal Correctional Complex in Terre Haute, Indiana, Montgomery was administered a lethal injection. Witnesses reported she appeared calm but disoriented, muttering, "I'm sorry," to Stinnett's family. Her last words were a whispered, "No," as the pentobarbital took effect. Montgomery's execution reignited debates about the death penalty's application to individuals with severe mental illness. Critics, including UN human rights experts, condemned the act as a retrogressive step that failed to account for her victimization. Conversely, prosecutors and some victim advocates argued the punishment provided closure, with Stinnett's mother, Becky Harper, stating, "Justice was served for Bobby Joe." The case also underscored systemic failures in recognizing and treating mental health. Had Montgomery received intervention during her childhood or marriages, experts contended, the tragedy might have been averted. Her story echoes other cases of fetal abduction, such as those of Darcy Pierce, 1996, and Julie Corey, 2009, where perpetrators' delusions overrode moral boundaries. In the aftermath, legislators proposed bills like the Mental Health Justice Act, aiming to divert mentally ill offenders from death row. Yet, for Montgomery, reform came too late. Her execution remains a somber reminder of the interplay between trauma, mental illness, and justice, a narrative not of monsters, but of broken humans and a society's struggle to reconcile punishment with compassion. This is True Criminal Records specifically happened in the United States. I will be bringing all true criminal stories to you here on my channel. If you would like to get more information like this, comment and subscribe to my channel now.